Our ancestors made the trek to Washington, D.C. to go and talk to Congress, go and talk to the president. And when they got there, they were turned away.
It was one of the biggest things in my life that I would probably have to do, and I wanted it so bad for my people.
We were being asked to prove that we were still in existence as Indians.
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of the bill, Senate 1357.
A bill to reaffirm and clarify the federal relationship of the Little Traverse Bay Band of Ottawa Indians and the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians as distinct federally recognized Indian tribes and for other purposes.
These two tribes have waited for years for federal recognitions. And we have a federal recognition process in the Bureau of Indian Affairs that does not work.
Sitting there through that whole process and knowing what could be for our tribal members if we did receive federal recognition, the possibilities of what we could do.
I was part of the people, and I was telling my story.
Ani, my name is Winnie Wemagwas. As Director of Archives and Records and Cultural Preservation for my tribe, the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Ottawa Indians, I am honored to share the story of our journey to reaffirm our sovereignty.
The bill is considered read the first time. The gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Richardson, will be recognized for 30 minutes, and the gentleman from Wyoming, Mr. Thomas, will be recognized for 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Mexico.
Mr. Speaker, S. 1357 is sponsored by Senator Levin and co-sponsored by Senator Regal of Michigan. It's a bill enormously important to our good friend and colleague, Congressman Dale Kildee. The bill reaffirms and clarifies the federal relationship with the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Ottawa Indians and the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians. These two groups are the political successors to the signatories of the 1836 Treaty of Washington and the 1855 Treaty of Detroit.
Our reaffirmation process began when a treaty was signed in 1836.
The 1836 treaty was a necessary tool for the people to get an agreement between the tribes living here and the government people, U.S. government, who wanted to become the state of Michigan. And they had to deal with the tribes here. The tribes had their own tribal laws, but the bands had to come to an agreement, a consensus, and then agree to the treaty.
The Treaty of Washington of 1836 reserved hunting and fishing rights for the tribe. But because there were some other discrepancies with the treaty, the Ogimak wanted a new treaty. In 1855, the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Ottawa Indians and the signatories of the 1836 treaty entered into another treaty with the United States government. This treaty, the Treaty of Detroit, reaffirmed our reservation boundaries and our right to remain in our ancestral homelands. This treaty contained a provision that was meant to recognize our sovereign status and government-to-government relationship with the United States. But generations of federal officials wrongly interpreted the provision of the 1855 treaty as terminating our government status.
All through the years since the treaties were made, the tribal people, the Odawas, knew that treaty was there and they expected certain things from the government. And when they didn't get it, the tribe continuously kept forming groups to send people to Washington and remind them that the government has a responsibility to the tribe.
Throughout the 1800s and 1900s, many delegates continued to go to Washington. One of them was Margaret Blackbird Boyd.
After the Civil War, Margaret Boyd went to Washington. She went there because she was concerned about the loss of land for all the veterans who were returning from the Civil War. When they left, they had land, and when they came back, it had been stolen from them. And so she went out to Washington to try to redress that wrong. And the way she financed it was with taking quill boxes to sell to pay her way. She actually got in the same room with the president, but was unable to speak to him about this particular issue. And when she came back, she was running out of quill boxes, and she literally became destitute on the way back. She described how heavy of heart she was as she pulled into the station in Harbor Springs and then saw all the people waiting to talk to her.
During the early 1900s, three main groups worked together to unite the Odawa politically. These groups were the Michigan Indian Defense Association, the Michigan Indian Foundation, and the Northern Michigan Ottawa Association, which was established in 1948. The Northern Michigan Ottawa Association, or NMOA, became our main governing body, with Little Traverse being Unit 1.
Prior to any state recognition, that's all we had was the NMOA, which were different units based on the Durant role, and those units eventually became federally recognized tribes.
There you go. That looks really nice. My mom and dad, along with my grandfather, Levi, started Northern Michigan Ottawa Association. It was organized to sue the federal government over land claim settlement in Michigan.
In the heyday, you might say, of the organization, these units would hold all kinds of social events and fundraising things, and it was a big, active organization.
What I think the Northern Michigan Ottawa Association did, though, was all these units that were involved here. I think it showed the Indian people in Michigan that being organized and working together, you can accomplish things.
The Ottawa Association evolved into local community organizational groups, and actually it was kind of the unit that kept the Odawa people together as a governmental entity. They acted on behalf of the tribal interests. They traveled to Lansing when there was need for state involvement, and when they were able to afford it, they were able to travel to D.C. to represent and advocate for the tribe at the national level.
They would drive at times to Washington, and I can remember them saying, well, the car broke down on the way back, and I can also remember when they were organizing all the units in Michigan, they used to have to go to Detroit, Grand Rapids, all over, and they wore out 3 cars, I think, in maybe 5 years.
3 different occasions they spoke before Congress. Mom would come home and tell me exactly what she said, and Dad would mention the things that he said. Tell this congressman that, and I told so-and-so this.
NMOA played a ground role here of starting to establish this, of people doing things and getting out there, and it has evolved into very successful tribes here in Michigan.
The NMOA won a land claim judgment on behalf of the tribes in 1971.
That claim was filed in the late 40s and didn't get settled until 1971. We won a land claim settlement at that point of approximately $11 million.
The argument was, well, if we're not federally recognized, then how are we paid in the first place? You know, we were paid originally for this land, but it was at a fraction of what it was worth at the time, and that's what we were suing over. And, you know, if we're not federally recognized, why did the federal government pay us? Who did they pay?
Throughout the 70s, many skirmishes took place over our fishing rights.
The fishing issue was the one that brought about the reorganization of Little Traverse Bay bands. The fishing issues kept coming up in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, all through the years, till finally, you know, that the tribal people and the government had to deal with it. And by dealing with the fishing issue, we had to reorganize and establish our reaffirmation with the government.
In 1984, a grassroots group formed. This group hosted an elders council at Y Camp Lake in Cross Village.
To get money, we had to form an organization. It was called Bibskabine, which meant coming back, which was what our philosophy was, to come back to our culture, our way of life, to learn our old stories and legends, and language was one of our priorities.
During this time, a new tribal council was formed. The members were Ronald Wemigwas, Kathy McCann, Frank Edowagijik, Peggy Hemingway, Joe Mitchell, Yvonne Walker-Kijik, and Veronica Medicine.
We'd been doing elders councils for several years, and we'd been working on the question of how we were going to become federally recognized. And we'd done a lot of stuff through the fishing rights. We had a grant from the Campaign for Human Development through the Catholic Church that was working on the questions of fishing rights.
What really started the reaffirmation project was that the one fisherman, John Case, he lived in Charlevoix. He was continually getting pinched by the DNR. They would arrest him and take his equipment, and he came to us and asked, can you help? So we went to Michigan State University because we know we needed expert testimony for court, and that's when we met Jim McClurkin.
Peggy Hemingway, Ron Wemigwas, or Wemigwasi, and Pine Showman came down to the MSU Museum to have a meeting with Chuck Cleland. And they wanted to recruit Chuck to work for their tribe. And Chuck called me into the office and said, these people are down here. They don't have anything to work with, but I think you should really help them because they have a case.
It was the early 80s when all this started happening. And we went to a federal court in Kalamazoo. The judge ruled against us, Judge Enslin. He said that the Animal Way could not be the political successors to the treaties, but bands could. So that's when we changed the name to Little Traverse Bay Bands.
In 1989, we started meeting at Kathy McCann's house. We discussed what it was going to take to become federally recognized. We actually had a hearing with Pete Taylor, who was the head of the staff for the Senate Select Committee on Indian Affairs, where we talked about the different things that might be necessary. Were we going to do legislation? How would we do things? And if we were doing legislation, what should it take? And that's where he told us that it should be reaffirmation. It shouldn't be restoration or recognition. It should be reaffirmation.
We filed a petition with the BIA, but we knew that was a long shot. I mean, we would get it, but it would take a long time and like $1 million. And we worked with the one elder a lot, and through his history or his old stories, he said, well, whenever we had a problem with the government, we would go directly and deal.
The elders who guided the process, Solomon Francis, and particularly Sam Keeway, but a whole host of other people of their generation, had told the young people that they could seek federal acknowledgement, but they had to go through Congress. Getting any bill through Congress is a huge challenge because you have to educate two bodies of legislators. You have to legislate everybody in the House of Representatives, but then you have to win the support of the Senate as well.
Whenever we had the opportunity to go to Washington, we used every opportunity we had to meet with our congressmen, meet with legislators, and to further our cause, to give them the information that we felt they needed to vote in our favor.
When we started going to Washington, the tribe would introduce themselves. Ron would introduce himself as the chairman of the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians. And people would say, well, who are you? Where do you come from? Are you a tribe? We didn't know there were Indians there. And we decided we had to do something about that. And we had to do something pretty darn quick.
We got a grant from the Ruth R. Mott Foundation in Flint to do a history book for the tribe. We produced Gabajuwe book, or The Way It Happened, which is a visual culture history of the Little Traverse Bay Odawa. We were able to take that book and present that to the different congressmen, to their staffs, to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, to all the different places.
At all the hearings, Frank would pass out these books. He'd pass out the books. He'd show the pictures and say, that's my great, great, great. It created a solid image on Capitol Hill that moved us, moved Little Traverse beyond all the other petitioners.
Let me say that this tribe has even sent a book, the tribe that the Ottawas that we're doing right now. They compiled a book on their historical claims and sent to this committee.
In 1992, Tribal Council sent a delegation to Washington to testify in front of Congress. This delegation consisted of Ronald Wemigwas, Patty Dyer Deckrow, Harriet Booth, Donna Miner-Budnick, Frank Edwagijik, James Bransky, James McClurkin, and Vine Deloria.
We were really pushing the system by having legislation introduced, really pushing the Bureau to show their incompetency and how long their process was. And there were rumored at the time that they're not going to do this because if they do, they're going to open the floodgates to all of these tribes wanting to go through their legislative process. Then what we had to do was distinguish how we were unique from all the other tribes. At first we weren't very optimistic at all, and we thought that we had a huge battle against the Bureau, and there was a lot of testifying on the Bureau side. After that, things started to get more positive. We started to build in those relations with our Congress people, and we finally got to Washington thinking that, yeah, this is going to happen, and we're finally going to make it happen.
This delegation came home disappointed because the president in office, George W. Bush, told the committee that he would veto our reaffirmation bill if it passed his desk. Tribal Council decided to wait for a new president. In November of 1992, William Jefferson Clinton was elected President of the United States and was sworn into office in January of 1993.
When Clinton was elected, I remember I thought maybe that would make a big difference. This change in the political climate, I think that's really what made me feel that it was going to be something that we would be able to do.
What you do when you introduce a bill is you build a legislative history for it. And so you know that it may not pass during its first time it's introduced.
Congress was going to rely heavily on the federal agency in charge of Indian Affairs, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, for advice on whether federal acknowledgement through the congressional process was a proper path. And if the Bureau of Indian Affairs would have come out very strongly against the legislation, it would have been very difficult to muster the votes to get the legislation through. Sort of one of our principal objectives was to at least neutralize the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And tribal delegations spent a lot of time in Bureau of Indian Affairs offices and talking to the people at the Branch of Acknowledgement and Research. And through a lot of diplomacy on the part of tribal leadership, and a lot of sort of personal contact with people in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, we were able to convince the Bureau to not actively oppose this legislation.
Pirtle, Morissette, Schlosser, and Ayer was a lobbyist for us. They did thousands and thousands of dollars of work for us for free, and particularly a woman named Patty Marks who was working on our case for us.
Patty worked pro bono for 3 or 4 years, and once Patty was on board, she guided us through the process. She actually got us the hearing.
On August 4th, 1993, Tribal Council sent 3 more delegates to Washington, D.C. to testify in front of the Natural Resources Subcommittee on Indian Affairs. This group consisted of Shirley Naganash Oldman, Frank Edwagijik, James McClurkin, and then project manager Daniel Chingwa. On February 10, 1994, the same group returned to D.C. to testify in front of the United States Senate Committee. Julie Shananaquit Skippergosh, then enrollment officer, also accompanied them in order to meet with officers of the BIA Bureau of Acknowledgement and Recognition.
BIA's claim and argument was that we were not proving or certifying that we had the blood quantums that we said we had. As the enrollment officer, I did travel with released copies of enrolled members' files so that we could show BIA that our files were well documented.
Little Traverse Bay Band's representatives were in town testifying over at the Senate building. It was heartening to see tribal members and friends actually sitting at this table facing the senators and the committee, pressing their point that Little Traverse Bay Band should be recognized as a federally recognized tribe.
Senator McCain would be chairing the hearing. Senator McCain was opposed to legislation being passed for tribes for recognition at all. He thought everybody should go through the acknowledgement process. Senator McCain made his own statement in which he was opposed to the legislation.
My name is Shirley Naganash Oldman. I was born and raised in Harbor Springs, Michigan, in the neighborhood that is commonly known as Indiantown. I gave testimony to the first session of the 103rd Congress in the Senate of the United States and the United States Committee on Indian Affairs. My objective was to explain to them how we, Waganaksan Odawa, were able to exist as a people since our treaties were signed. I began my testimony by introducing myself in Anishinaabe Mowen, Ani Gigat Tangwa Sekwa Nijdikas, Nimki Odawa Kododam, Waganaksan Indinjaba. I wanted them to know that we still have our culture and that we still have our ghost suppers. We have our Anishinaabe foods, our sacred fires. I knew at that time that I had to be convincing because there were so many people before us that came but were not heard. And this was our chance. It might be our one and only chance to be heard. So I know I had to speak from the heart.
We really had to prove that we were native and native in our land. A lot of tribes had lost that, where we still had the beauty up here. We still had our homelands and our traditions and our people. I had to give this written testimony to let them know that I'm still Odawa, I'm still Waganaksan Odawa, and they can never take that away from me.
At first when I was talking to them, I was nervous. I thought that I was talking to a stone wall because I didn't think that they were really listening. But their body language kind of adjusted and they've kind of tilted their head to a point where I think maybe they are listening.
Senator McCain would gradually, through the time as we gave our testimony, and we talked about Margaret Boyd, we talked about all these different individuals, he gradually leaned more and more forward in his seat.
There was a presence there. Yes, there was a congressman, but there was also, I felt, our ancestors there with us when we were testifying. After the testimonies were done, it was like a big sigh of relief, and tears of joy just came out because it was like, I did it.
There was so much passion and so much emotion, with the membership that this ought to take place. And I do believe, that was an effective moment in the testimony.
But I still had that doubt in my mind, wondering if we really got through to Senator McCain.
And at the end of the hearing, Eric Eberhardt, who was one of his staff person, walked by and said, "This bill is a slam dunk. You hooked him in the heart."
By the time we got back to our debriefing, it was all over Washington, already a buzz that what we had done was very positive and we were really doing a good job, and everybody sat up and noticed us, and we really made an impression on them that we were Odawa and we were not going away, we're here.
When we came back, we knew that we were heard and we were able to tell our story. It was really a waiting period for the vote to come down and making sure that the vote took place and keeping in contact with the congressman.
Governor Bill Richardson, who of New Mexico was a representative at the time, and he led the floor debate.
Mr. Speaker, S. 1357 is sponsored by Senator Levin and co-sponsored by Senator Regal of Michigan. The bill reaffirms and clarifies the federal relationship with the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Ottawa Indians and the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians. The subcommittee held a hearing on this bill September 17, 1993, at which the tribe submitted well-documented evidence that they should be immediately recognized. Mr. Speaker, I yield 7 minutes to the author of this legislation, the distinguished gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 7 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I use the words reaffirm and restore rather than recognize because historical documentation proves that these tribes have in fact had formal government-to-government relations with the United States government from the time Americans first entered the Great Lakes region to the present. Mr. Chairman, I know these Indians. My family for 3 generations has known these Indians. My grandparents, who immigrated from Ireland and settled in northern Michigan, right where these Indians still live in the same community, my grandparents traded with the grandparents of these Indians. My father tells of that trade. My father tells of the Indians moving around, having more mobility then, until they were forced increasingly into smaller and smaller areas. I feel a strong responsibility to correct this injustice for the grandchildren of those who helped my family when they arrived from Ireland in the 1880s.
The floor debate was pretty dicey because there were people in favor and people against. And the people against were saying we should go through the administrative process. And what was this reaffirmation anyway? Chris Shays said that.
I rise in strong opposition to S. 1357, the Odawa Recognition Act, which would extend federal recognition to the Odawa Indians, completely bypassing the BIA's federal acknowledgement process.
My concern based on this issue is the fact that when we're talking about federal recognition of a tribe, that we have no basis to really determine its validity. We are providing sovereign nation status to that tribe. They become a nation within a nation. They get automatic federal aid. And they also, and this is the centerpiece of, unfortunately, what motivates some, but not these tribes, they get the right to have major gambling facilities if they so choose.
The time to acknowledge our obligations to these tribes is long overdue. These bills will permit this and future generations of tribal leaders to address the more pressing problems of providing for the economic and social welfare of their people. For these reasons, and for the fact that these Indians have lived in the same area as a community, an identified community, whose blood quantum is very high, that these people should be recognized for what they are, and I ask for the reaffirmation of that reality.
Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union has had under consideration the bill S-1357, and pursuant to House Resolution number 501, I report the bill back to the House.
The question occurs on adoption of the bill. Members in favor will vote aye. Members opposed will vote nay.
When we were watching on TV, I was on the phone. We had people lobbying in the halls outside of the House. This is where this vote was. So I was busy on the phone working, even though I was hundreds of miles away, working on lobbying right up to the vote. And we had no idea how the vote was going to go for sure. We had a pretty good idea we had the votes, but we didn't know for sure.
238, the nays of 108. The bill is passed. Motion reconsider is laid on the table.
When the vote finally came and it passed, it was really an elated feeling, and it was a real feeling of relief. But we knew we still had to make sure that we weren't going to get a veto. President Clinton had not indicated to us that he would veto, but he hadn't absolutely said that he would sign either.
On September 21st, 1994, President Clinton signed our reaffirmation bill and ended our 158-year battle with the United States over our sovereignty. In honor of our victory, the tribe hosted a sovereignty celebration powwow, which was held in Susan Hall at Green Sky Hill Church.
We successfully argued that we weren't creating a tribe, but the federal government was acknowledging that this tribe was a sovereign entity and that we had always been here.
The Little Traverse Bay bands had accomplished something that everybody thought they could never do. The tribe achieved a small miracle.
The fact that this ultimately made it does give one faith that democracy at times works well.
It was almost like you could feel the happiness that everyone in that room had. There was an Eagle staff that was passed to our community by Tom Peters. And this was the first time that our community ever had an Eagle staff. This was given to Joe Mitchell to take care of, and Joe today still carries that staff with a lot of pride.
For the first time in hundreds of years, our people today have more this generation has more rather than less.
I'm happy because I know our children have a future now.
I feel like our ancestors were there too, because the room just felt more full, like there were more people there.
For the people that died before us, the people that are here now, and the people in the future, Creator bless the Waganatsi Odawa.
Chizem Nadu, Miigwech Gamizjang, Manda Mnogizgat. Miigwech Ge, Manda, Kinoma Ge, Gamizjang. Miigwech Ge, Igimawen, Gamizjang. Nongo, Minwa Jashko. Miigwech Ge, Kinoma Ge Wen, Mishum Gamizjang. Anama Tauge Egimajik. Jimno Niganiwat. Kinomo Gag Giganguk Jimno Wabminang. Gudingo Gewinwa Ganiganiwak. Kinage Anamatau Gunda Waganak Sing Udawak Jimnoam Dewat Ejimusa in the Kiing Miigwech, 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 Miigwech.